wonderful evening because finally, after a lot of meeting, we are glad to welcome here in Perm and in Moscow and in St. Petersburg, Dr. Giyoma Tibергьена. And this is the professor of Glasgow University. And I'm happy that today we can talk about very interesting questions and about very interesting topics. We will talk basically about experience economy, and of course, we will talk about the experience of place, rural and heritage sites. So I'm really glad to welcome you today. Please, can you tell us a few words about your experience and of course about your basic work and about your master's program? Please,
Sure.
Leon.
Okay. It is an honor to be here today. Thank you very much for inviting me and for allowing me to present this topic today, because as Katya said, it's been a long conversation from last year to, approximately, we've been in contact for about a year now, starting with a research project or research grant until now. And between last year and this year, we had a number of conversations, and of course, conversations on your master about the experience economy and museum management and events, but also what we're doing here at the University of Glasgow, because we have, at the moment, we have 3 masters in tourism, heritage, sustainability, and development. But I'm a program leader for a master's in management and sustainable tourism with the Adam Smith Business School in Glasgow. So this is a very prestigious master's degree. It's a triple accreditation master's degree, and where the students share half of the semester in Glasgow and half of the semester where I am based at the moment in the south of Scotland, in a small city called Dumfries. So our students spend half a year in Glasgow and half a year in a rural area where I am based at the moment. Of course, with COVID-19, this year is a very unusual year. All our students are, like you now, over Zoom, getting the content over Zoom. And we've got students from all over the world. From China, we had students from Russia last year. We have students from France, from Portugal, from Japan, literally all over the world, and even from Kazakhstan. Why I'm mentioning about Kazakhstan, because I've been living and working in Almaty for 9 years. Therefore, the reason why I speak a little bit of Russian, my Russian is a bit rusty now, because I lived in Almaty between 2003 and 2012. And then I moved to New Zealand, to Auckland, to start my PhD. And then I completed my PhD, which was about the development of ecotourism in Kazakhstan, with my supervisors were from New Zealand. And when I finished my PhD, I managed to get a job at Glasgow University. And I've been working for Glasgow University over the past 5 years now. And I became a program leader, and I'm teaching more particularly tourism marketing, rural tourism and sustainable tourism. And I used to teach as well events management until this year. And now it's my new colleague who's teaching this course. But beyond these topics, all my research experience is centered around the question of what is a good tourism experience. What is, in particular, what is an authentic tourism experience? And I'll go back to this notion of authenticity, which will be the center of our discussion today. And I'm planning to show you, when I discussed with Ekaterina about the content of today, we had a number of topics, and I know you were interested in sustainable tourism, some topics in tourism marketing, but I finally decided to choose this topic because I think it's a good introduction of what are the key issues in tourism studies today in terms of tourism experience. Of course, my experience and my research is very niche because I've been looking at a wide array of examples from Central Asia, but I also decided today to show you a couple of examples from Scotland and from New Zealand as well, in terms of heritage tourism. So today we're going to talk more particularly about heritage tourism, which is really what is interesting me in research. Now, my PhD study was about the ecotourism development in Kazakhstan, but centered on the question of authenticity. So I'm going to talk about this to start with, but then when I moved to New Zealand, I also looked at the Maori heritage. I don't know if you are familiar with who are the Maori people. So it's they are coming from Pacific Islands, and they have a very particular heritage in New Zealand. So we'll look at that as well. And my most recent research project was about the development of tourism around former Gulag sites and Gulag museums in particular. And I know that you have a very interesting array of Gulag museums in Russia. In fact, I just saw very recently that the Moscow Gulag Museum received 2 days ago an award from, I will retrieve exactly the information, but an award from a European Union agency, which was very welcomed. And I thought that was so interesting that it happens right now. And we might talk about this later on a little bit. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. Now, I'm going to share my slides and we can give it a start. So I make sure, can you see it?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the talk of, the nature of my talk today is about understanding the role of authenticity in the experience of place at rural and heritage tourism sites. A multiple case study analysis. Maybe before I start, I would like to ask every one of you, or maybe some of you, what is your conception, or how do you understand the term authenticity in the tourism experience? Who would like to maybe give it a go? I know.
So who will start?
I know it's a bit.
Yes, it's quite complicated.
Yeah. Okay, we can have a discussion after my presentation. So maybe it will help to unfreeze the environment. So basically, when I start about this question with my students, it's the question I'm always asking: what does it mean to have an authentic tourism experience? And the reason behind asking this question, for me, specifically in heritage tourism, is to, I think the word in Russian is autentichna.
Yeah, authenticity.
Yeah, real.
Yes.
Genuine or true. So there are lots of synonyms. But behind this question is, if I talk about heritage tourism, the question of how can you have a tourism experience that is meaningful to you, that makes sense? Because a lot of the tourism industry in the past has been centered around lots of package tour, lots of, experiences that were involving a lot of different tourists at the same time. But the trend in tourism, and more specifically in sustainable tourism, is actually about allowing fewer tourists in a place, allowing more exchange with local populations, more activities between tourist and host population, more participatory activities in particular. So this question of authenticity across the board, and it's not only in the UK, it's not only in France, or, it's really around the world, even in Asian tourism. A lot of discussion is about, okay, I'm in a place, I am somewhere. It can be a rural area, it can be an urban environment, but what does it really mean to have an authentic tourism experience? So when I talk about this question, I always use this slide as an introduction because I think it's a very good and easy way to understand what I mean by authenticity or what is meant by authenticity. When we look at what we call the tourism encounter, you always have the demand side, the tourists, who have their previous level of understanding of what is culture. So for example, if I ask you, what do you think about Paris? The stereotypes would be, oh, Paris is romantic, Moulin Rouge, the baguette, you know, all sorts of cliche about the French culture. But if you really want to experience Paris, you know, that Paris is actually offering very different things than all these stereotypes. So what tourists want more and more to achieve and discover is what we call the true cultural heritage. Okay, and I could ask you the question, what does it mean in a country like Russia? The interesting thing between the demand side here and the supply side, so this is the life of the host populations of the local communities, is this interesting area here, what we call tourism cultures, or cultures staged, which means, and it's valid for events as well, what do you showcase? What do you perform? What do you create so that tourists can have this understanding between the real culture and the tourism culture here and what the tourists actually want to see? And what has changed over the past 15 to 20 years is what the tourists want. And when we look at, or we talk about the experience economy, the experience economy is a lot based on experiential experiences, existential experiences, and meaningful tourism experiences. So a lot is happening in this in-between, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to throw some terms for you, and don't worry, I'll send the slides to Ekaterina with all the references, because when we talk about authenticity and the tourism experience, there's a lot of correlation, lots of terms that come into the mix, such as intimacy, such as reciprocity. So what are the relationship between tourists themselves, between host and guest, between a tourist and a guide? And this very important notion in the experience economy of existential authenticity, which means that an experience, a tourism experience, can be true if you can link it to your inner aspirations, to who you are. And then the latest developments, which were really interesting to see, were about authenticity and performance. Performance meaning, you know, what is being staged, what is being performed by local communities or even by tourists, and how it's understood. And I'll show you a couple of examples. And then the very latest one, and I just published a paper, an article about this, is actually about this notion of disorientation, the fact that not everything is predictable. And when we look at the experience in heritage tourism, we can very easily see that, you know, you've got the package tour, you've got the contrived environments, you've got a product, a tourism product or experience that is really well managed and fixed. But in fact, more and more tourists really want to see things that are unexpected as well. They don't necessarily want something that is really, very squared and very organized all the time. They want to have a little bit of both. So if we talk about sustainable tourism, and if we talk about how tourism operators and how tourism organizations work with tourism nowadays, especially since the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of what is being, developed nowadays with the staycation movement, I don't know if you're familiar with this word, staycation, it's actually because international tourism has stopped, how domestic tourism can take over. I mean, if we take the situation right now for international tourism, there's no international tourism anymore. So all the tourism is domestic tourism. And if we look at authenticity under the prism of domestic tourism, what is being is perceived as the new authentic in the academic literature, and more operators are trying to develop this, is to live like a local. Is this idea that a tourism experience is not necessarily an experience where everything goes really quickly. And there's also the notion of immersion into your environment, and how, as a tour operator, how as a tourism organization, you can create those environments that allow immersion of tourists. So these three aspects are called the new mottos and markers for meaningful tourism experiences. And if you pay for something, if you pay for a tourism experience, you want to have something that makes sense to you. So reinventing the local in tourism beyond the classic aspects of the experience economy and the tourism marketing economy. There's a lot of very interesting correlations to authenticity. Is, for example, more and more tourism experience focus on the insider perspective. Insider perspective can be found, for example, through sites like Couchsurfing, or going on a bed and breakfast with Airbnb. So you get local advice, you get local insights of the place. And to some extent, it's much more powerful, if you think about it, than going to a hotel and being completely disconnected from what is the real life in this country. Okay, so I remember when I was still living in Kazakhstan, Couchsurfing was emerging, and it was really interesting to see that for some international visitors, it was the only way to discover the real life in Kazakhstan, the real life of the nomadic culture, for example, or what remains of the nomadic culture. And not necessarily, they couldn't find this in a hotel where people were just speaking a little bit of English. They were able to do that being hosted in local families. So all these informal, authentic encounters, the fact that tourists more and more now are co-producers of the tourism experience, meaning they want to have their say, they want to share their experience with others. We look at TripAdvisor, for example. And more the fact that there's the importance of collaborative local knowledge provided by the host and intangible resources. What it means here is all these little things that you can't provide, like comfort, but you can provide amazing advice to tourists through, for example, by being hosted in their own place. So when we talk also about cohesive, resilient communities empowerment, why authenticity again is important? Because tourism makes sense for local communities as much as for the tourist. A form of tourism that doesn't consult the local communities is perceived here, at least in the United Kingdom, as poor management. Because in the UK, and I will show you some examples, we have a form of tourism that involves all the stakeholders, not only the government making decisions for what is right or what is not right to develop, but local communities, tour operators, local NGOs, national, regional, and local governmental officials. And really, all the stakeholders have their say in developing tourism. So authenticity lies at the heart of this as well. Now, this is a segmentation strategy that is 5 years old, but that was created by Professor Simon Milne. Professor Simon Milne was my doctorate first supervisor, and I worked at the New Zealand Tourism Research Institute for him. And when I left New Zealand in 2015, I left just before the conference, or just after, sorry, the conference. And he presented this research that was really interesting for what I'm talking about, because what you're seeing here is a typical traveler going to New Zealand. But I would argue that it's also could be a typical traveler coming now to Scotland as well. So you see, they are called interactive active considerer. That means what? That means they're quite experienced. If we look at the international market, they're world citizens. They enjoy the outdoors. They enjoy the life's indulgences. They value authenticity. They're risk takers. They're big spenders. They're tech users, and they use the internet to plan, and they are opinion leaders. In other words, they are very experienced travelers. Okay, so when you know that, you need to factor this in your marketing strategy and in the way you're selling your product and in the way you're talking to visitors as well. So behind this and behind the visitor experience, the magic word, if you can say so, is what we call tourism yield. And this word here is very important because what is meant here is that you can maximize the output and the input for visitors and community only if you assess what the community wants and you assess what the visitor wants. So what happens in between, this transactional aspect of the tourism experience, is really what makes tourism interesting. And throughout this Get Local approach, the project from Simon Milne, that was the whole approach, and it's called Get Local because the whole approach was to try to be as much faithful to the reality of what the community, how they wanted to sell themselves, how they wanted to be part of the tourism experience, and what the visitors wanted. So they were trying to understand how these two communities or these two groups of stakeholders could interact and match. So a couple of examples around the world, and I just would like you to bear with me here because they might sound for you maybe a little bit old-fashioned because it's Kazakhstan, or because it's maybe aspects of museums that are a bit old-fashioned as well. But remember that the talk today is about authenticity. And my goal into all these different research projects was to evaluate authenticity, and more particularly the perception of authenticity from visitors, but also from local suppliers, from museum curators, from directors of museums, from tour operators, from governmental officials, and so on and so forth. So really, just to exemplify what I'm talking about. So we'll start with ecotourism in Kazakhstan. And if you want more details, you can look at my publications that would be at the end of this presentation. So this is, for me, one of the most interesting example. This is, maybe you know about them, called yurts. So these are former nomadic shelters that are still used a couple of months in a year in Central Asia, especially in countries like Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. And this is, you know, that this is samovar. This is the way also they use to boil tea and serve tea to the tourist. This was a very interesting example because that's a picture I took for my PhD, and it was about welcoming a group of around 35 tourists. A lot of them were from Germany, from France, from the USA, and this was really in the middle of nowhere in Kazakhstan. And these yurts are actually Chinese yurts. They're not authentic in the objective sense. They were absolutely not authentic from the nomadic people perspective. But for the tourists who were in this tourism setting, they had the most amazing experience and what we call sense of existential authenticity, just because they were able to share the experience with the semi-nomadic communities who were there to explain them about their traditions, even about how they're using samovar, even if it was imported. It was not, genuinely Kazakh. So, all these heritage traditions that were shared with them. Now, we could argue, and I was arguing, that these yurts were not traditional in the Kazakhstani sense of it. And I'll show you some examples. So what we call existential relationships, that's a quote that I got from some visitor. So what was authentic were the little moments during the visit, such as living together with other families in a small village as a community where everyone knows each other, where in the summer people dine outside and drink kumis, horse fermented milk, from their own cows and camels, when people sleep outdoors during spring and summer, and sing songs with a dombra, 2-strings traditional guitar, to entertain the family and guests. A lot of spontaneity was perceived as rare and unique. And again, if we link it back to the experience and the experience economy, what was valued by these tourists was the fact that the experience was shared with the local population, which rarely happens now, if you think about it, especially with very big groups of tourists. And by the way, I found the contrary in New Zealand. Everywhere when I traveled to New Zealand, I could barely see the New Zealanders and share some experience with them. What I call creative reciprocity, what was very interesting there is that the organizers, are not aware that we're really interested to discover more about the homestay providers' lives. That's a tourist saying this. So the tourists themselves, more and more, want to understand the local perspectives. They want to interact with the homestay providers and with the local population. They don't necessarily want only the comfort. So that if we talk about ecotourism, that's the best you can do in terms of the tourism experience, when you are able to really exchange with the local population and talk about their lives and culture. Okay, so that's an example inside one of the homestays in a Kazakh village. And so it's not a yurt, it's inside a house. But you can see here, so this is a tourist here, another tourist here, another tourist there, the local people here, the tour guides, people from the government, and this is KTA, Kazakhstan Tourism Association. That's the ecotourism body, and that's another tourist. And that's a classic example of ecotourism in Kazakhstan. So this is called besparmak, it means 5 fingers in Kazakh, and it is a traditional meal made out of horse meat. And they simply share their everyday life with these tourists. Okay, and in terms of authenticity, remember, and we talked about intimacy, this was believed as the most authentic moment of their tourism experience. Okay, this is another interesting example. These are pictures. This is Bahit, who's selling traditional carpets, and she's welcoming tourists in her home who sleep actually on traditional mattresses called karpe. And these are small souvenirs given to tourists at the end of the tour. And again, in terms of craft making, it's really interesting to see, because souvenirs, as we say in English, act as repositories of your tourism experience. And especially if you think about it, when you come back home, imagine you go to Paris, you might bring back a little Eiffel Tower. They do the same in Kazakhstan, but they give a yurt, because the yurt is the symbol of the nomadic culture. Okay, now it goes even further, because when we look at ecotourism and sustainable tourism development, this is the same lady, Bahit, as here. She's a bit older here, but they have managed to provide with the governmental organizations the first eco-certification of this village. And it was very important, especially for them, because the village lives only on tourism now. It's the only way to have income. And when you are eco-certified, it means you can guarantee some levels of comfort, some levels of good sanitary levels, toilets, etc., and of course food and appropriate standards for food. So the eco-certification, in terms again of authenticity, is very important, because it also it acts as a branding element for tourists to make sure that they're going to the right guest house. I'm switching now from Kazakhstan to New Zealand. In New Zealand, as I said, the first inhabitants of New Zealand were the Maori people. For the ones who like rugby and the All Black teams, the Maori All Black team start always games with the haka, which is this traditional dance to scare the opponent. But in New Zealand is probably nowadays, I would consider, the #1 country in terms of how good they are in terms of tourism marketing, country branding, but also heritage tourism, the way they are selling heritage tourism. But if I talk about ecotourism more specifically and heritage tourism, they also use exactly the same type of techniques in New Zealand throughout the heritage villages. So they use souvenir shops, they use daily cultural performances, on-site craft making, hangi, which is the traditional way of cooking food, and marae. They're also explaining all the symbolic aspects in their own church. The marae is the Maori church. Okay, well, these are a couple of examples. So these people actually live in a village, and they live in their village, but they made their village as a tourism attraction. And when you go to this village, you can see Maori people, and you can just see them because they have lots of traditional tattoos. You can see them here as well. But they do on-site craft making, and you can buy them on-site. That's a picture from his shop. You can buy also traditional Maori, ornamentation in souvenir shops. So lots of very ethnic T-shirts, you would call them. But the other thing that I thought was quite interesting, again, around the question of authenticity, is how they stage their culture. Remember this very first slide that I showed you. They wear traditional outfits and sing traditional Maori songs for about 15 minutes. And then you can, when you pay, you also pay for that. You pay the ticket at the entrance of the village. They show you the church, the Maori church, and that's a heritage from the European side. So it's not a Maori church, it's a European church here. And they also show you, and again, that's the interesting part here, how you can participate in the activities. So this is a traditional way of cooking food for Maori people. These are hot steam, so hot steam water coming from the earth. And you can choose here your ingredients. And usually it's, quite, meat, potatoes, vegetables, cabbage. And then they show you how to cook this, and they do it with you. And this is called the participatory activities in Maori tourism. I'm going back to Kazakhstan now. And I think for some of you who live in Moscow or who live in Perm, that would make maybe some sense to you, because this is one of my latest research projects that I undertook with Gulag museums in Kazakhstan. So Kazakhstan, very interestingly, has some of the biggest Gulag sites, or former Gulag sites from the Soviet times. And they have developed Gulag museums on the premises of the former Gulag sites. And again, with Professor John Lennon, who is the leading expert in dark tourism around the world, we looked at how they use different techniques to enhance the experience at museum. And when I started my talk, I said, oh, you might see that a little bit like old-fashioned, because you will see the type of techniques they're using are, again, very interesting from an authenticity perspective, as well as could be a little bit questionable to some extent. So Gulag tourism, this is a map of the Soviet Union. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but what we found with Professor Lennon is at the Gulag Museum, they're using different techniques. They're using what we call architectural and spatial authenticity, tactical and visual authenticity, existential authenticity, again, narrative authenticity, and performative authenticity. So architectural and spatial authenticity, it's actually about what we call the built heritage. So this is one of the Gulag Museum in Algiers. This is a new museum. In Algiers, only incarcerated women in this camp. But this is very unusual architecture that they were using there. So when we interviewed the senior management and guide, they wanted to say that the shape of the museum had some meanings. The fact that they had no windows, so people could try to imagine what it was to be there back in the days. But the other museum, which is called Gulag, this is a picture back in the 1950s, and this is how the museum looks like today. This used to be the administrative building of the whole Gulag, and this is now where the museum is hosted. So they're using the former premises to host. And for international visitors, this is very interesting because they think that it's very authentic because it's about the real building. Whereas when we talk about new buildings, most of the international visitors really wonder the different meanings of what these buildings are, and it's not very obvious. They also use a lot of photographs and information. I think this is nothing new to you, I'm sure. It's very much like any museum around the world. They use a lot of memorabilia about, different souvenirs and different belongings from the former prisoners, different photographs, different documents linked to the prisoners, former prisoners. But they also use dioramas to showcase what happened back in the days. So these are recreated rooms to show what happened back in the days, made by little figurines. And they also showcase what happened in Algiers. The children of the women prisoners were taken at the age of 2 and put in a different orphanage. But they're going much beyond this, and that was the quite unexpected part of the experience. Again, we're talking about the tourism experience here. They have in Gulag, the underground is like recreated cells just to make tourists. You remember we talked about immersion, and that's really the goal of what the museum curators are trying to do. So they wanted to recreate a very scary atmosphere, a dark atmosphere in the basement. So to show and frighten visitors inside the cells. But they also had some I thought very interesting, because I was there when they did it. They tried to recreate what happened back in the days with all the museum stuff, where recreated the scenes when the prisoners arrived. They were using the clothes of back in the days, like a theater. So they were recreating through theater plays what really happened, but on the site. So they had former barracks, they had guards, they had dogs, they had, as if it was a theater play they were trying to do. And they were inviting all the local communities and international visitors to witness this. The last thing that they did, and I thought that was a very, I think, even controversial way of doing this. But again, from a tourism experience perspective, this is quite interesting because it's also done in a number of European countries, Latvia, Lithuania, and so on. They invite visitors and tourists to spend the night at the Gulag and act as prisoners. And that's going very, very far in the tourism experience. Okay, so every year they have the night at the museum event, and they try to invite something like 500 people to do this. Okay, is everything going okay so far?
Yeah, we can hear you and we can see the presentation, and we are comparing our examples. Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So I'm going to switch from ecotourism to Maori tourism to Gulag tourism to now go to Scotland, and where I live and work now.
Mm-hmm.
So when I came after all these different case studies really about the tourism experience from heritage and rural sites, the region where I live in Scotland is very rural, and very beautiful. And again, this question of authenticity was in the back of my mind all this time. And I was trying to wonder what it meant here, especially from an events perspective. And the very interesting fact in Scotland is that, again, this question of authenticity is coming back. And it's coming back through different sectors of the tourism industry, from nature activities, heritage, destinations, festivals. But you see, there was a very clear link between providing authentic experience and improving the customer journey. So trying to make meaningful tourism experience, but also very good tourism experience throughout a range of different aspects of the tourism experience: food and drink, transport, accommodation, and digital connectivity. So, as I said earlier on, in Scotland and in the UK as a whole, it's not about having a top-down approach. It's not about the government saying, this is how it's going to happen. This is what happens in Kazakhstan, for example. In the UK, there is a new approach, a bottom-up approach towards destination development with local groups, business communities that have a say in leading the local agenda. And the whole idea for having authenticity and heritage and events being linked all together is to have actually increased the linkages between all these stakeholders that actually didn't talk to each other much. So the interesting approach when we're trying to develop tourism in the region, and the region where we are and where the masters in tourism are is called Dumfries and Galloway in the south of Scotland, is actually about product development now, based around the assets, the strength and opportunity, about, simple questions. What is a positive, authentic and memorable tourism experience? And what can be done to improve the visitor experience in the region? Okay, so we thought that from a tourism marketing perspective, more research is needed, and how the results can be shared to help shape and influence collaborative marketing. And what would be the implications for the visitor segmentation strategy? So, as I said before, not to talk about extensive marketing strategy, but more, again, refocusing on authenticity. And it might surprise you, but the latest trend in tourism is not to have a very fast-paced experience. Means you're trying to maximize things all the time.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually the other way around. It's about patience. It's about immersion. It's about improvisation. It's about making your tourism experience cost-effective and sustainable and responsible, meaning responsible in a sustainable tourism way. Just to make your tourism experience as much sustainable as you can, using local resources, local populations, involving all stakeholders and so on. So one thing that is being done is called woofing. So it's, for example, welcoming tourists in local farms to share the part of their life with them. And to, in return, the tourists are working for free for these homestay providers. So that's one tiny example of slowing down tourists, and lots of them are actually students doing this. But if we look at events, what is really interesting is that the national event strategy for Scotland is in fact centered again around one of the key themes is authenticity. So the strategy 2020 identifies festivals and events and business as two of the 4 key assets that provide authentic experiences for Scotland's visitors, and which underpin the industry's growth ambitions. So on a national perspective, for the whole of Scotland, again, when they develop events, they're looking at events that reflect the true heritage of Scotland. And when they are making the most of Scotland's assets, they actually, doing a very simple SWOT analysis. I'm sure you're familiar with that: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. But beyond doing that, they're looking genuinely about what makes Scotland attractive for the whole world. First of all, people. People is at the heart of every tourism and event strategy in Scotland. Strong sense of identity, proud people at the heart of their communities. Cultural identity and heritage. Rich history and ancestry, reputation as a leading nation in the fields of education, with lots of amazing galleries, iconic poets, musicians, and so on. The natural environment, the array of beautiful and dramatic landscapes. I will show you some of them, from loch, beaches, islands, forests, etc. The built facilities, all these castles, all these long historical, Stirling, Edinburgh Castle, and so on. And what is really interesting is they organize the best heritage events in those places. And they have a range of what we call signature events, from the Edinburgh Festival. Celtic Connection is the #1 music festival about Celtic music. I'm sure you're familiar with that. And that is part of their portfolio strategy. So when we're looking at authenticity and events, again, the key question is, how can we preserve all these traditions and package it for tourism? And what is called commodification of culture for tourism. And the key questions here is, again, this kind of compromise between what the local populations, how they see themselves, and how the tourists are buying it, how interested they might be about this. Okay, so when we develop destinations and when we talk about authenticity, it's always a compromise between the host, the guest, so the supply side, the demand side, and how the place is defined. Okay, so looking at event authenticity, as I said, what is the tourist perspective? What is the level of community control? What is the level of cultural meaning you want to give? How emergent authenticity, how that means how the local people can make this authenticity real, and how it's performed is really the key question. Okay, so in events, you might be aware of Donald Getz. He's the world-leading expert, academic expert on events. And already back in '98, so 22 years ago, he was already talking about event authenticity. So, and you see here, it's about the level of cultural meaning, the level of community control and acceptance, and how much it diverges or it converges to actually make it real. Okay, so when we're looking at the experience economy, a lot of very interesting developments can be seen here. First of all, the level of engagement and flow. The concept of flow in the experience economy is key because it actually says how much tourists and event goers, event attendees can engage into the event experience. But if we look at heritage events, how history and what is called playful history can be used and packaged to be celebrated into material and immaterial culture. Okay, so another small example from another Central Asian country. So what they wanted to do there is a little bit linked to what I showed you in the beginning with ecotourism in Kazakhstan. They were doing what we call reenactment of events. They were performed by societies and groups to celebrate and reaffirm some aspects of a culture. So that used to actually develop a very strong sense of place. And the festival I'm talking about is happening in the middle of the the Tian Shan Mountains in Kyrgyzstan. And it's a very beautiful place that I actually managed to witness, to celebrate what is called the horse culture, the nomadic horse culture. And the festival goals and objectives were quite interesting because They were trying to relaunch the breeding of the Kyrgyz horse. They wanted to showcase equestrian games and races. They wanted to develop national and international framework to protect the biodiversity and the diversity of culture. They wanted to rehabilitate the Kyrgyz horse and the revival of the traditional craft industry, from saddlery, felts, embroideries, and so on. And so the handicraft development was very key. And of course, they wanted to relaunch the ecotourism industry there, not only for the local people, but for guides, tourist companies, which were organizing equestrian and pedestrian trekkings with horse of back saddle. Okay, so these are examples of nomadic people showcasing their culture, but organized in an event with traditional music, traditional clothes and guitars and songs, and traditional horse games. So that one of this is a traditional game when a woman and a man go from one point to another, and the race, and they're trying to, and the man tries to catch the other person there before the finish line. A traditional game. But they also have traditional games around eagle hunting. But you see here the yurts were coming back. And this is a festival that happens in October. And usually the yurts disappeared from that time, but they kept them specifically for international visitors to showcase again the authentic aspect of their culture. And also, of course, you also have the horse riding games. They also have what is called Kogburo or Buskashi, which is a traditional game with the carcass of the mutton. And you've got two teams competing with each other, but that is organized specifically for the festival. So again, under the prism of authenticity, that's quite interesting because you can see that this is a game that is not really, played anymore, but it's played and organized and staged specifically for tourism and for the event. Okay, so this cultural commodification that I'm talking about is actually celebrating the old nomadic ways, even if their contemporary iterations aren't perfectly authentic. And I thought that the quote from this horse trekking guide was really important. It was saying, of course, horse games have been commercialized, but this is our history and our past. And if we stop playing them, our children might ask, Father, did your father play internet games? Tourists also want to know who the Kyrgyz people are and what a nomad is, and horse games are the proof. So these events serve to preserve the local culture. Without the event, there is no money, and the culture is dying out. Now, this festival moved from a very tiny, small, community-led festival to a very big festival. And you can see here Steven Seagal, who is a famous actor. And now these games are organized in a much bigger and wider way. So you see, this is the ceremony, the new ceremony that was kicked out, that was organized in 2016. And you can see now this festival became much bigger, and it's a celebration of the whole nomadic culture. Now, is it still authentic? That's a very good question.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean by locally led festivals. So when you reenact historical events, the question of identity is very interesting. And all of these roles, professional heritage industry, public policy, tourist, event organizers, academic in the field, is the same question as I mentioned earlier. What makes these events meaningful? So authenticity and identity in the production and consumption of postmodern cultural heritage attractions make a lot of sense and are very important nowadays. Okay. I would just like to finish with the event strategy in my region now, just to show you what is being done. So as I said before, this is a little bit more of a breakdown of this authenticity and improving the customer journey through product development based around the strengths and opportunities in the area. But when we look at the vision the mission and the delivery. And this is a castle that is about 20 minutes from where I live. That's the kind of landscapes that we have where the masters in tourism are located. But you see here, by 2020, Dumfries and Go will be the destination, of course, for quality, value, and memorable experience. And they have clear roles into developing tourism from 300 to 330 million pounds, and the delivery through providing authentic experience, improving the customer journey. So the estimated annual value is around 269 million pounds. A significant opportunity to develop and improve the region's tourism product and support rural economic diversification. Because in rural areas, as you may know, the big challenge is how can you diversify your economy, and tourism can play a very big role, and events can play a big role. So when I look back at the National Tourism Strategy for Scotland, you see Dumfries and Galloway, where we are, has been elected as the best rural event location in Scotland. And events are seen as the top, the biggest tourism generator. So events in the region where we are generate more tourists than people just traveling to the region just to visit different castles and attractions. So events are now the biggest tourism generators in the region. And they do it through 7 signature events. So you might not know them, of course, but I can tell you that this is using the heritage of Robert Burns, which is the national poet of Scotland. But all these events have a different purpose, and they're all part of what we call a portfolio of event strategy. So they're trying to develop events all around the year, not only in the summertime, but they want to drive tourists across the whole year. And out of these 7 signature events that are supported by the local council, 4 are artistic events, and 3 are like Scottish Rally, Tour of Britain, and World Championship Ice Hockey are international sport events. Okay, the thing is, the benefit of signature events bring a lot of economic benefit, cultural benefit, sporting benefits, media benefits, community benefits, but they also enable to develop skills, professionalize stuff, and that's the interesting thing, again, from an authenticity perspective, they're quite indigenous to the region. That means they are contributing to developing the identity and the profile of the region. Okay. Now, the next 10 years, what is the strategy about? They're saying that change in technology, society, and consumer behavior has resulted in new travel attitudes. Okay. So what they want is to embrace these new attitudes. And what they want to do is to actually look to connect visitors to values, needs, and behaviors. And they're look at that immersive experience, limitless discoveries, and digital relationship connections have become now more and more experienced. So they want to have an experience about that actually meets these 4 criteria now. People, so still going back to Scottish people, so where communities embrace visitors and the stories of our destinations, world famous assets are brought to life by Scotland people. Strong partnerships are in play to protect and enhance the environments while growing social, cultural, and economic wealth. So they want to develop memorable experiences. And the way they can do that, for example, is again around authenticity. Visitors to cities like Edinburgh or Glasgow, they look for genuine experience, and the future of tourism is rooted in authenticity. That's the new strategy. That's not something that was developed 20 or even 10 years ago. That's the next 10 years. So tourists want to live like locals, and Glasgow's appeal at the heartbeat of contemporary Scotland. Okay. So that's the director of city marketing of Glasgow. And same here. They want a form of tourism that drives positive change about the experience to deliver responsibly and in a sustainable way for many years to come. Okay, so what they call actually memorable experiences is the very best of authentic and memorable experiences. Wide range of immersive, responsible, and authentic visitor experience, so that visitors can stay longer, see more of Scotland, and spend more. Conclusions. There are a couple of things that I just wanted to leave for you to think about. Is behind authenticity and the visitor experience is the idea that now tourism needs to embrace the very important need to include local communities. You can't do tourism without including local communities, specifically in rural areas and specifically in ecotourism development. What is needed to be done today is to redefine the boundaries of the tourism products and experiences. It's no longer enough to provide a price, a product, but you need to think about what is experience, what is valued by tourists, what are their expectations, what is a memorable tourism experience. You need to think about authenticity as a unique and important feature in tourism products and experiences. Nowadays, and in particular in tourism marketing, authenticity is used everywhere. Oh, it's autentične. It's authentic. But what does it really mean? What do you put behind this word? Because when authenticity is well managed or is well used, it increases return visitation. And in return visitation is the hardest thing to do in tourism. You may have a visitor once, but what you actually want is to have return visitation. You want people to come back, or you want tourists to advise, to recommend your tourism destination. Okay, so what we call the local sense of place is about actually building and develop theme trails, walks, activities, reduce the pressure on tourism hotspots, reflecting the local sense of place, and sustaining capacity. So this community-generated content and local knowledge is very important in doing this. In events, it's about achieving community ownership of the event. So you see the host community, the event organizers, at least in the region where I am based, the host community plays a huge role into trust, engagement, and commitment with local businesses. They're all local co-producers of what the events are doing. They also work with the governmental officials, and they work with tourists, not without them. So the tourists are fully engaged in the experience, so that it gives and enables a community ownership of the event. Now, in terms of integrating this in public policy for the host destination, that's really the key question. How can you integrate this approach into the public policy making? And we try to wonder this. You know, I'm still working a lot with Kazakhstan about how they can improve their ecotourism industry there, the heritage industry as well. But also, you know, we're also working in Scotland now with developing the south of Scotland as a tourism destination, and trying to have the governmental officials, and as you know, money comes from the government. How can they be more involved into this? Because I strongly believe that, you know, we need a different form of tourism now, especially that focus on organic farming principles, alternative lifestyles, that change the nature of the host-guest relationship, and that encourage people to stay longer and reduce their environmental impact as well. Because something that we didn't mention much is the fact that behind authentic tourism experience, you are using local people, local products, and that is sustainable. Just 2 or 3 more slides, which are pictures. This is how Scotland is selling itself internationally. That's the 2018 tourism strategy. And this is the hashtag Scott Spirit. This is called a pod. It's like a little place in the Highlands in the north of Scotland where tourists can stay. And that's how now tourism is focused in rural areas of Scotland. But also, this is one of the landscape. This is a castle in Scotland. This is how tourists are embedded now into this landscape. And the last slide I wanted to show you from the Visit Scotland, which is the national DMO of Scotland. That was their message 4 years ago. Scotland is an individual place, not one of mass tourism, but a special mystical place that offers a real and authentic experience. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for this very interesting lecture. And I can tell you honestly that many topics that you mentioned today we discussed, and they are actively discussed nowadays. Even the question, what is real authenticity? For example, maybe someone wants to see real life of Russian people or Tatars people or any sort of people, or some are trying to reconstruct the life of the 19th century. So where is the boundary between this real life? And this is a very discussional question, and also the topic that we would like to talk about. Thank you very much. It was truly very interesting for us. And I see there are a lot of questions, for example. Can we start with the questions, please?
Yes.
Dilara, I've seen Dilara and Anna would like to ask questions. Who will be the first?
Maybe I.
Okay, and then Dilara. Please, Anna, and then Dilara. Please start.
Hello, I have a question. The first, maybe I missed it, but you said that you lived in Kazakhstan, and how much time did you spend there, and what struck you the most?
What is your second question? Sorry.
You said that you lived in Kazakhstan, and how much time did you spend? How long you lived in Kazakhstan, and what struck you the most? Your unusual experience, maybe.
Oh, okay. So I've been living in Kazakhstan for 9 years. Deviatlet. And the most amazing tourism experience for me was maybe it's going to make you laugh, but I had a Lada Niva. You know this car, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm.
And in Kazakhstan is the most reliable car because you can fix it anywhere. You don't have too much electronics. And I moved from Almaty to the Kazakh Altai. And that trip to me was, we left there for 2 weeks. It was real adventure. That's when I decided to do my PhD about Kazakhstan, because everything that I met there, the small villages, the former nomadic populations, the beauty of the Altai mountains and lakes was absolutely stunning. And from an authenticity perspective, everything was authentic. The landscape, the people, the way they were living, what we managed to exchange with them. They were so happy to see us because no one was going there back in the days. And interestingly now, Kazakhstan is a quite I wouldn't say popular destination, but they're doing a lot of work in destination branding. And they actually try to develop a strategy centered on ecotourism. They actually have a lot of Russian tourists, which is actually, I think they're maybe the first segment of tourists for Kazakhstan coming from the north of Kazakhstan, of course, with the neighboring countries. So to answer your question, that was my most amazing experience, really traveling with a Lada Niva for thousands of kilometers in the Kazakh steppe in the middle of nowhere.
Thank you. And the second question on tourism, will artificial repression of local customs, for example, ceremonies and national costumes make a great impression on tourism. Wouldn't that be too artificial in your opinion?
This is a very good question.
Yeah.
It's a very good question because actually, if you take the Maori, you know, the traditional dance that I showed you, I thought that was a joke. You know, if I can push it like that, I was very critical about what they were presenting to me because they were dressed in traditional clothes, but I was asking them, is it really the clothes that you're wearing every day? And of course not. They were wearing them just for tourists. But then they had a contemporary guitar, and then I asked them, is it really an instrument that was used back in the days? I'm sure it was not this kind of guitar. But then they were, of course, I didn't understand what they were talking about because they were singing in Maori language. And so I was assuming that what they were saying was very, very non-traditional. And I was wrong because another student that I was living, you know, in Auckland with was from this village. And she told me, Guillaume, you know, actually this performance that they're doing for tourists is very authentic. The traditional songs they sing are exactly the same as they were singing 100 years ago. And so just to show you that with authenticity, it's all about your background, your experience, your perception. And I would say probably in heritage tourism, the most important factor is what you know and what you don't know. If I come to Russia tomorrow, I know not a lot about Russia. So all my first impressions, I've been to Russia before, but all the first impressions about Perm, for example, will be very fresh and new to me. And you could argue that, you know, I could find something authentic and then you could tell me, no, actually, it's absolutely not authentic. This is just organized for you. So you always have to be careful with this question of authenticity because, as we say in English, it is a multi-sided concept in tourism. And it's used in a lot of different strategies, and sometimes it's not used very efficiently and very effectively.
Thank you. And the last question, do the people in photos from Kazakhstan really live in youth, or was it just a show of culture?
Yes, it's actually called in English culture on stage. So, you know, the picture I showed you about the yurts and the samovar.
Mm-hmm.
This is a yurt camp that was created in the middle of nowhere just for tourists. Nomadic or what we call now semi-nomadic people don't live there anymore. So they had a group of German tourists in a bus, and they organized the yurts just for them. And then they served them a cold beer. When Kazakhstani Kazakh people are Muslim people and they don't drink alcohol, for example. So, you know, there's a lot of different, what we called cultural configuration or reconfiguration is how do you stage culture for tourism to make the tourists believe that it's the traditional culture, but in fact it's not. And I can just give you a little, a little like experience from my data collection when I was there. There was an anthropologist from Germany who knew a lot about nomadic culture, and she said, Guillaume, I don't think this is authentic at all and traditional. This is horrible because these are Chinese yurts. They're not traditional yurts, you know. So that tourist was completely disappointed by her tourism experience.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please other questions. Maybe you have. Dilara is from Kazakhstan, and actually she made a remark that she was impressed by the lecture, but it was not a question at all. Dilara, would you like to say a few words, please? Dilara? Yeah, she is probably out of net anymore. Please, do you have any questions, dear students, and maybe you would like to ask something?
Mr. Guillaume, I would say that I'm very glad to your lecture. Your first scheme was very interesting. For example, I agree with you about the Paris because I mean, my previous dreams about the Paris and my impressions after I visited, it was 3 stages that were exactly that were shown. So I agree with this scheme, and this picture maybe, and the topic of authenticity that you explained is very important for Russia, and it's very it's new trend of our tourism for Russian tourists and also for foreigners. And I'm not in this sphere, but I see that our touristic companies go in exactly in such a way to develop this type of tourism. And Ekaterina is also doing exactly the same. And I would yes, it is your last our last the last discussion between you and Anna is seemed to me very interesting, because it is narrow distinction between history, the original living of people in this place, and also the modern type of living in this place. So if those people wouldn't, if people wouldn't take the original clothes, it wouldn't be very interesting for tourists, don't you think so?
It's a very interesting question again, because I think the answer to that can be multiple. It all depends on what the tourists want. And that's why doing research about your segmentation strategy is important, because if you don't know what they're looking for, well, especially in the notion of tourist expectation, a lot of tourists, when they are looking for, and I'm talking about niche heritage tourists, this is not all tourists. Not all tourists want the authenticity, but for the ones who really want authentic tourism experience, you have to know what is their background, because if you know that they know a lot about the context. So for example, if you welcome a group of tourists who go to Perm, and they know a lot about what's going on in Perm in terms of heritage, in terms of even the Gulag legacy, you can't really stage anything to them. You need to talk to them in the real sense, with real stories, with the facts that come from historians, the facts that come from truly specialists, especially about, if you talk about ecotourism, about fauna, about flora. And the best people who can do that are local people, local historians, local explorers, local, when I was in Kazakhstan, the best people who knew the most about the flowers, about the animals, about the local lifestyle, were people who were scientists, and most of them, I have to say, Russian scientists. And these people knew exactly where to take tourists, where they knew all the stories behind the places. So I worked a lot with them, and there's in particular a tour operator called Nomadic Travel Kazakhstan in Karaganda that I worked extensively with, because they are the ones who develop Gulag tourism, ecotourism, all forms of tourism in Kazakhstan, because they know what they're talking about. But if you welcome a group of tourists, like the yurt I showed, they were coming from East Germany, from Berlin, and they were coming to the tour because through word of mouth. So because they had a German friend who knew the organizer of the tour and said, oh, there's a great tour in the Kazakh steppe, why don't you join us? And they came from East Berlin. The day before they were partying in Berlin, and the day after they were in the middle of nowhere under a yurt. And even if the yurts were Chinese, they told me, oh, Guillaume, this is so authentic, just because they had no idea about the nomadic culture. Whereas this anthropologist who knew in great detail what the nomadic culture was all about in terms of lifestyle, in terms of food traditions, in terms of craft making, she told me, no, I never want to experience this tour again, because for me, it's all fake and it's all staged. So my answer to your question is know who you are dealing with, and make a little bit of research about who your tourists are, a little questionnaire.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. I would like to continue the question of Anastasia, if you allow me, because I have a case, very curious case, about the different approaches towards authenticity. So imagine on the territory of Perm region, there are typical Tatars villages. And when we visit these villages with Oxford delegation, for example, with some scientists from Oxford University and some other universities and so on, we were shown two types of performances and songs. The first type is authentic, but it's according to the Tatas culture of 1950s, 1960s, and so on, in bright costumes and beautiful costumes and so on. But another type is the authentic type of the 19th century. And it was made in the black costume with some decorations. What kind of authenticity do you think is most interesting to the traveler? The one that reconstructs the 19th century, but which is so far away from the modern situation, or the one which reconstructs, for example, the second half of the 20th century, and there are many elements that they use in their everyday life. So what is your opinion? What type is more attractive to them, please?
I would say both, and I don't have an answer to you, Katya, because again, it depends on the type of tourists that are going there. The first example you talked about in academic terminology in tourism is called culture frozen in time.
Yeah.
Okay, so you take the culture and, you know, a bit of, we can even call it a stereotyped culture. It's a type of culture that people want to see.
Yeah, so, that's true.
Yeah. So they project their expectations, their perception, and we had the same problem in Kazakhstan, because all these stories that I mentioned about, they were expecting to see nomadic people on horses, drinking horse milk and being very wild. And when they arrived to Kazakhstan, they saw Porsche Cayenne and people who had very civilized lifestyles. And suddenly they were like, oh my God, this doesn't correspond to my expectations.
Yeah.
So it's the same example with your Tatar show. What the first is called a culture on display, or stage culture, or a tourism culture. The second one is also authentic, because it's about how the people live today.
Yeah.
And if I can take a corresponding example in Kazakhstan, now you find yurts with a Sputnik on the top with this electric connections, and people have electricity, they have internet, they have 3G, 4G internet, and they live under a yurt. And it's what Kazakhstan is all about, and it's also authentic. So my answer to you is to look at a different variation of authenticity, the objective version of it, the socially constructed, the existential one, the performative one, and to some extent, if you look at museums, the narrative one. What I mean by that is, in the academic literature in tourism, there's the article from Ning Wang, 1999, about existential authenticity is very powerful, because it says that any experience can be authentic, providing it creates an emotion inside yourself, even if it's staged. So, like when I was at this Gulag museum and they were trying to recreate this performance about the women arriving in a camp, being mistreated by the guards and so on, it was a very moving. It really created a lot of emotions for me. And I was also with friends. I was with a Korean friend whose grandmother had been deported in Kazakhstan, and she couldn't look at it. But it was a show. It was made for people to understand what happened in the days. And then when I started to talk with local communities about this, and to the museum curators, I asked them the question, I said, are you going too far with this? This is not right. You're not respecting the dignity of the victims and so on and so forth. And then they said, Guillaume, it's the only way for our young children to understand what happened, because young children are not interested to read anymore. They want a hashtag, and they want to be able to have on a mobile phone and type the hashtag, or, have a photography and know about the information. So any type of performance, when it's staged for tourism, you need to understand what is behind. What are the suppliers want? What do they want to convey in this? What do they want to do?
Thank you. Please, dear colleagues, dear students, do you have any questions you want to ask? Please.
I don't have any questions, but I also want to say to you, thank you very much for your lecture. It was a pleasure for me to hear from Kazakhstan, because I'm from Kazakhstan and now I'm here, and I love all the stories about Kazakhstan. And when I hear about something about Kazakhstan, I feel good. Thank you.
Okay, please. Other questions, dear students, dear colleagues, do you have any other questions? Because
I also want to say thank you. I'm from Kyrgyzstan. I'm student of American University of Central Asia. So it was very pleasant to hear all this information. And so I also want to just add that, yes, I agree that we cannot, represent authentic culture, authentic tradition, because our life is modernized. And so, as you said, that these yurts are from China, and of course we have people who make yurts with their own hands, but they are very few. So so that's why maybe it's easier to just buy these Chinese yurts and Chinese goods. Yeah. And thank you very much. And I also wanted to say that this slide which you showed about 2016 sport game at Chabush, yeah, it was in Kyrgyzstan. It was the world nomad game, and it takes place in 2 years, in every 2 years. So last time it was held in 2018, and it had to be held in 2020, but because of quarantine, it was moved, and it's planned to be held in 2021 in Turkey. So I think it's also, if you have possibility, you can go and to show this World Nomad game, because it's like Olympic game.
Yeah.
So there are our traditional games, nomad games, and I think you can, so you will have pleasure to see this. So thank you.
Thank you, Roshan. And I have to say that Kyrgyzstan, my experience of Kyrgyzstan was absolutely amazing with, this village in Bokunbayevo. I even bought a yurt for my children in Bokunbayevo. So I put a yurt every summer in my Scottish garden from Kyrgyzstan. And I celebrate the nomadic traditions, but Achabish Festival was the most amazing nomadic culture festival I've ever experienced. And I have to say that with the years, it became less and less interesting because it was bigger and bigger. I really love this kind of small scale festival where I could actually really interact with local people. But your country is beautiful. I was there in 2019. They invited me actually at your university for a talk, and we talked about different strategies for developing ecotourism in Kyrgyzstan. That was really interesting actually, and it was in Bishkek. Yeah. So thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Any more questions? Please, dear colleagues, dear students. Well, I have one more. So for us, ecotourism is more associated with the tourism to the national reserved parks or to the, national parks and so on. So we noticed that the amount of visitors in national reserved parks in the previous year in Russia, and particularly in Perm region, increased for about 30% in comparison with the year 2019. So what about Scotland? Maybe you have noticed some figures. If there was any growth rate, or maybe the amount of tourists increased or decreased, maybe you have some figures, because it's also a very curious case for us. Mm-hmm.
It's a good question. In fact, I've got some students who are doing their dissertations right now about this, because I also teach a course called Rural Tourism. And we talk a lot about what we call stewardship measures to develop tourism, mostly in rural areas. And national parks are usually located in rural areas. The national tourism in national parks in Scotland is a huge business. It's not a business, it's a huge type of, a huge type of tourism. The COVID-19 pandemic, for about a year now, literally destroyed international tourism for Scotland. The result of that, the direct result of that, is a development of staycation. Okay, so local domestic tourists from Scotland, from the whole of the UK, visiting Scotland, not going overseas to travel, as they are usually doing. So rural areas and national parks suddenly became, last year, a huge part of the tourism industry. The visitation numbers, I don't have them with me now, but I can check them. I think was the immediate effect was, I don't want to say something from my memory, but it must have doubled, if not tripled, from the number. So the Lake District National Park, which is in England, the most famous national park in England, was saturated by tourists. So the direct effect was over tourism in national park, which was very surprising and never really happened. And Scotland has a great number of national parks. And fortunately for them, or you could say unfortunately for local communities sometimes, this over-tourism was very beneficial, but also had very strong implications in terms of environmental pollution, litter, the lack of infrastructure development, the lack of toilets, the lack of bed and breakfast locally, the lack of environmental protection measures for the fauna and the flora in those national parks. So it created visitation, but it created a lot of different issues. And that's the job of tourism managers. These sites have a lot of rangers who are looking after the national park, but they were completely outnumbered by tourists. And I remember I could even send you a couple of BBC newspaper articles that were actually showing lines of cars in those national parks with people, because that's the only thing people could do.
Yeah.
So yes, to answer your question, it is, and again, because now the UK is completely closed to international tourism, it is again on the table for this year. But we have a lockdown now, so no tourism is allowed apart in your own region. So all the hotels are closed, everything is closed because of the pandemic. So it will be very interesting to see in the coming month what the government is deciding and how they will allow people to travel again. But this year is going to be another big boom for all these national parks for sure.
Thank you very much, because we also felt the over-tourism in the national reserve parks, and that was so strange and unexpected for us. And even in January, when we had these long Christmas holidays or New Year holidays, for the first time we felt the over-tourism in our basic national parks, and it was also very surprising. Okay, thank you very much. Dear colleagues, do you have any more questions you want to ask today? Please.
Guillaume, how do you think about the development of this infrastructure? Is it a point of public policy, or it should be the problem of touristic companies?
Yeah, well, I've got a very good case study for that, but we will need another lecture.
Certainly, yes, we will need another lecture.
Because there's a tourist route developed in the north of Scotland called the North Coast 500 miles. That was developed by my colleague, Professor John Lennon. And they are so successful that now it became a destination that is hated by the local communities, because there is a single passing line and a lot of people go there with their camper vans, and there's no place, there's a lot of traffic jam, there's a lot of litter, there are no toilets, there's a very low number of hotels and bed and breakfast. And it's a classic example of a successful route from a marketing perspective, with no public policy and no engagement of the local government. And what is needed to be done now is that at the national level, but all these at the regional level as well, that each of these local councils invest in infrastructure development and public facilities for tourists. If they don't do this, it's going to be the end of tourism there, because the place is saturated by tourists and there's no compensatory effects for the local communities. So that's what I'm saying. It's a classic example. It's a classic example of not involving all the stakeholders that need to be there when you develop a route. It's been wonderfully branded, wonderfully marketed. They make a lot of money out of it because they're using the North Coast 500 logo for branding. They're selling cars, they're selling all sorts of merchandising, but the infrastructure is not developed. So, you know, you take a very small road in Russia and you imagine hundreds of cars and camper vans there. The immediate result is local communities being very dissatisfied, and they don't want to work for tourism anymore. They actually, you know, they don't want the tourists there. So you have to be very careful with this. And you're right, it's a public policy issue. And at the end of the day, you know, I came to the conclusion now when I apply for research grants, the public policy issue is always on the top of the agenda, because without the government being involved, nothing is possible. And I can imagine in Russia, it's even more than in Scotland, because you need to have all the permissions, propose all of that to be able to develop tourism locally and have the money to do it, more importantly. So where is the investment coming? The private sector can make a difference, but to some extent, if you don't have the regulations in place, it doesn't work. My experience is it doesn't work. It didn't work in Kazakhstan, for example. In Kazakhstan, the tourism products and experiences were supplied by this scientist that I talked about. The only interest of the government was to make the biggest amount of money to maximize output in 5-star hotels locally. That's not what the tourists wanted. The tourists wanted to have a real authentic experience with bird watching, with, you know, they wanted to go and maybe a little bit of hunting when it was possible and allowed with permits. They wanted to have an experience with nomadic people. They didn't necessarily want the 5-star hotel with a lot of litter and pollution. So it's, you know, it's what I talked about when I mentioned about the top-down approach and bottom-up approach. You need to involve the local communities when you develop tourism. And you need to invite the government players on the table of negotiation to say, okay, practically, concretely, what can we do, you know?
Thank you very much. Very important point.
Yeah, yeah. And for us also, because we have many interesting places that now are being destroyed because somehow the local communities and what are not involved, like Stone Town, for example, or some places like this. Yeah, that's true. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, do you have any more questions? Want to ask something?
Can I please?
Yes, Yelena, please.
Yes, so dear Guillaume, thank you very much for your lectures, and thank you for your flexibility and the period when we prepared for this lecture, for this cycle of lectures. I hope this is only beginning and we will continue, and it will be like a cycle of lectures for the students, and we will invite not only PERM students, but also the students from HSC from other campuses. And I hope after pandemic situation, you will have a chance to come to PERM, and we will try to show you what we have. Yes, and you will join it and to help us with some advice, because your point of view also very important to understand how the people look, can see our region from abroad. Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. I just recently read one positive news about the Sputnik vaccine, that it was validated by the Lancet. The Lancet is a very important journal.
Yeah, most of us already have experience. Already I have 2 vaccinations, and I check my
bodies.
Yeah, antibodies. It's the good numbers of antibodies. It works.
Okay, so the Sputnik vaccine works.
Yeah.
Хорошо. Отлично. Okay. Okay, Katya, thank you very much for inviting me, and let's keep in touch. I can send you the slides if you want to.
Yes, we would like to have them, of course, and we sincerely hope that we will have some more lectures later on, because it's important for us, and many questions are so interesting and many topics are so interesting for us. So we would like to talk more, to discuss more events with you. So we sincerely hope you will come to us and see us. And we are glad that today some students from Moscow and St. Petersburg also joined us.
That's very good. Yeah.
And from our partner university from Kyrgyzstan as well.
Yes, and from Kazakhstan also, Dilara being our student now. Right now, she's in Kazakhstan. So thank you very much. We are looking forward to meet you again and listen to your other lectures.
Okay, and let's keep in touch and let's try to plan all of these in the future.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Have a nice weekend, everyone, and thank you for today. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. Have a nice weekend.
Bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
Уважаемые коллеги, всем большое спасибо. Наша встреча завершена. Спасибо вам большое.
Спасибо, все отлично,
Спасибо.
интересно, хорошо,
Да.
студенты замечательные. Будем продолжать.
Да, мы очень надеемся. Спасибо вам большое.
Хороших выходных всем.
Спасибо. Всего доброго. До свидания.
До свидания.
До свидания.